You feel me? What the hell are you? We are Venom.
Number 2, Venom. Okay, so as we get into the top 2 of our worst of 2018 comic book stories, as decided by our viewers, we're hitting our first and only comic book movie that made it to the worst of list. Venom probably shouldn't be much of a surprise, or it's showing up here in general, somewhere on the top 10 worst. It was widely regarded as a pretty bad movie and earned a pretty lousy reputation, especially among critics. I have to be honest, I skipped it after making 2 videos last year about how I basically knew the Venom movie was going to suck. You might imagine I wasn't too motivated to actually bother seeing it anytime soon because, well, based on every review that came out about the movie, I was right. It was going to be bad, and Sony was going to be Sony, and the movie was going to be what we expected out of it, and by all accounts it was. It was dumb, it was silly, it underplayed Venom, and it didn't live up to this character's awesomeness that we know from the comic books. People love to dump on Venom as a character. They say that he's limited and can only do so much as this sort of basic antithesis to Spider-Man. They usually haven't read any Venom solo series comics because if they had, they'd know that opinion is largely ill-informed. When we look at the Kate Stegman run that's currently going on with Venom, or even past works such as what Rick Remender did with this character through the form of Agent Venom, there's actually a lot of really cool potential to the whole idea of these alien symbiotes, and this being a villain against Spider-Man, or just this character on its own in general. Both of which have worked really well in the past, so there's no excuses here. There's no writing off this character as just being a dumb Spider-Man villain, or a cool-looking version of Spider-Man that's more hardcore and eats people. No, that's all potentially true, but there's more to the character than that, and if you're gonna make a movie about him, or any story about him, you kinda have to live up to some of the better stories regarding Venom. To that end, this movie had to at least somewhat live up to the idea of the comic book character, but it didn't have to reach that level of the best stories ever told regarding Venom. In fact, if it was even a little more mediocre, it probably would have been well liked by a lot of people. As we get into this movie, it is worth noting, I don't hate this film. I didn't finish this movie thinking that was a big piece of turd. I was annoyed and disappointed enough that I understand why this movie's on the list and why it got so high, but I'm not going to write this off as an outright bad movie. It is the worst comic book movie of 2018, although it should be noted that this was a very strong year in comic book movies, so that's not exactly Venom's fault. It does look better than some other comic book movies in the past, especially lackluster origin story movies. Thus, this isn't nearly as bad as something like Green Lantern, but everything on the worst of list thus far has had some value and something to offer, just ultimately either not enough or too much bad stuff that it doesn't quite outweigh the good stuff. That's all there really is to any story. It's very rare to find something without any value whatsoever. So Venom doesn't really get a pass in that regard either. But I did like certain aspects of it. Once Venom did show up, and it took him a damn long time to show up, we'll get into that in a moment, I did enjoy the back and forth between him and Eddie Brock. Tom Hardy did a really good job at presenting a different and interesting version of a typical superhero character. As the Venom symbiote recognizes to a rather annoying extent throughout the movie, Eddie's a bit of a loser. And he comes across that way right from the beginning, basically being this guy who's trying to fight for the right thing, even at the cost of his career and his relationship. And he's kind of schleppy, doesn't really have a good life, he dresses sort of in a very hipstery way. It comes across, especially in Tom Hardy's performance, as pretty intentional. Eddie Brock isn't supposed to be some cool dude, at least I hope not, because they do such a bad job of it that he comes across as a real loser. That's pretty good because it gets into everything that's interesting about this movie. Eddie and Venom aren't typical protagonist superhero characters. Venom's violent and eats people and attacks them maliciously, very gleefully declares that he, an alien, is just here to bring more of his kind to planet Earth so that they can consume everybody. That's it. That's all that his motivations are at first. And that's a pretty cool way to start the character and a pretty cool way to get the Venom movie set apart from all of the other superhero movies. Meanwhile, the love interest character, Anne Weying, played by Michelle Williams, is also pretty good. While at first she feels like a character there solely for the purpose of dumping Eddie Brock in the beginning so that he can have his low point before he meets Venom, she starts to become more and more interesting as the movie keeps finding reasons to come back to this character. And they're not like complete BS excuses. There's reasons why Eddie Brock would kind of have to seek her out, and the fact that she later is dating a doctor allows for Eddie to kind of quietly get medical examinations to get a sense of what's going on with his body without attracting the attention of the authorities. That's pretty smart. And it only gets smarter. There's actually a scene that I had heard about where Venom possesses a different person. And that scene ended up being pretty interesting, if you ask me. I quite liked it because it ended up changing the dynamics between one of the supporting characters and Eddie Brock. And in doing so, the movie became that much more interesting. By the end of the movie, Michelle Williams' character is actually a pretty cool part of this overall film, and she ends up with a strong understanding of what's going on with Eddie, enough that she becomes a really cool dynamic in this film. However, for all these cool moments, they're really just isolated parts of a much longer story that tends to wane in big ways. The villains of this story are very lame. The CEO is pretty mediocre, and just when he starts to show some more interesting signs to him and that he might actually have some partially benevolent motivations with his behavior, he gets possessed by another symbiote named Riot and just becomes this typical villain thing. And then the Venom symbiote, for very little reason given within the movie, probably owing to the fact that it appears a lot of scenes were cut out of this film, Venom just decides that he likes Earth and he's going to defend it and work with Eddie to stop Riot from bringing more of the aliens to Earth. And then we start to really get into the problems of this movie. Because I kept track of some things as I was going along, just to sort of get an idea of how this movie works as a whole. It took a total of 37 minutes to get interesting in this movie, with the first 36 minutes doing a decent job at kind of introducing some of these characters, even though there would have been more interesting ways to go about this, especially given the fact that there was a movie that actually could have introduced all this stuff called Life, which corresponds very nicely to the fact that the evil company in this movie is called the Life Foundation, that could have connected all of this together in a really fun way. I don't know if anyone else remembers that Life movie with Jake Gyllenhaal and Ryan Reynolds, but for a while people actually thought, because it was a Sony movie, that it was going to be a sort of backdoor introduction to the Venom character. And given the details and specifics of both of these movies, that could have worked really well. But no, we get the typical introduction where a spaceship crashes, one of the alien symbiotes escapes, and the others are captured by this evil company, and they start doing their usual thing. That first 36 minutes is devoid of anything I find truly entertaining. Just a bunch of cliched character moments and a whole bunch of drawn-out, boring exposition in a movie that ostensibly just wants to be a dumb comic book movie and have some fun. This film has a real issue with focus. On the one hand, trying to be a relatively serious take on a anti-hero in the strictest definition of the terms, with Eddie Brock, who's just basically a journalist and doesn't have the usual action hero traits that one would expect out of a dumb movie like this, and an alien that wants to eat people. And on the other hand, just wanting to be a big dumb and goofy movie, as it is more and more as we get farther and farther into this movie. Meanwhile, the real issue is that Venom himself, the actual symbiote, doesn't show up until 59 minutes into the film. Then, everything starts to get this flicker of coolness. There's this great chase scene and Venom first reveals himself and bites a dude's head off. And look, even though this movie is rated PG, they actually do a good job at making it very clear Venom is violent and dangerous without having to resort to blood and violence. I don't actually need blood. I need a crazy cannibalistic monster, and that's actually what they successfully deliver, regardless of the rating and amount of gore in the film. Who cares about that part? They correctly kept the dangerous aspects of Venom's character intact in this movie, and that's very important. But 59 minutes until Venom shows up in a movie that's only an hour and 32 minutes long. So close to the bare minimum of what can basically be considered a feature-length film that it's clear this movie has gone through a lot of hoops and craziness in production. You can see it in the film with uneven character moments and random changes in decision making from these characters that are clearly missing a scene or two to explain these changes, most particularly in the Venom character, which as you might imagine is pretty important. Meanwhile, it is worth noting, 59 minutes to see Venom in a movie called Venom is a pretty disappointing aspect of this movie. In fact, while I'm sure the comment section is going to be full of people saying, well, I like this movie, so what? So did I. But when you actually sit down and break this movie down into what's good and what's bad, the parts that everyone seems to remember and like are a very small proportion of the actual movie, about 20 minutes in length as best as I can clock it, in 112 minutes total. I have to say, if you're engaged with this movie at all, if your brain is on even a little bit, things fall apart really quickly. There's a lot of different plot lines that could have worked but are often overlooked or not dealt with enough, while cool characters with a lot of potential are immediately discarded for much more boring ones. And don't even get me started with the mid-credits scene. I'm gonna give it away because it's not much of a spoiler. While this movie was smart to have some restraint and not introduce Carnage in the first Venom movie, he obviously shows up in the mid-credits scene. And that choice of casting is one of the worst casting decisions I've seen in any comic book movie in recent memory. Enough that it would make some of the more questionable decisions of the DCEU bluster. I like the actor they chose, but he's not right for Cletus Cassidy and would never have been my choice at all. Choosing recognizable celebrities over what would be best for the role, and not really thinking things through in a meaningful way. It's not that crazy that 3 different screenwriters are credited for this film because it feels that way. Going in different directions, you can feel the push and pull of different writers and their influence on this film. It feels like it's trying to be 3 movies and it isn't even doing a decent job at any one of them. While this movie does have its moments, it feels like it's also lacking in key moments of ambition. Like I said, it would have been cool if they found a way to connect this to the Life movie. That would have been an interesting little detail and would have reflected the overall crazy ambition of the MCU a little bit. It would have been cool if Sony could have found a way to incorporate more Spider-Man related content into this film, thus making the potential of a crossover with the MCU a bit more exciting and on the table. And it would have been really nice if someone in the entire process of making this film had cut out a few of the indefensible, insane lines from this movie that crop up from time to time.
On my planet, I am kind of a loser, like you. But here, we could be more.
Excuse me?
And I'm getting to like it here.
Oh, you like it?
What is that?
Not what.
What really made you change your mind?
You did, Eddie.
And there's some great moments in this movie, and I've tried to make it clear that I do see some value in this thing, but I also think if we're all being honest here, this is a pretty messy movie. One reason that I'm holding back from fully tearing this movie apart is I do see some potential here. Regardless of what you and I or anyone else feels about it, we're almost definitely going to get a sequel to this thing. And while I might seem pretty down on it, I do not want to see Woody Harrelson playing Cletus Cassidy. That's gonna suck. There is potential in this movie. I see in this movie the potential for some positive changes that could make it better on the whole. A little bit of tweaking here and there would go a long way into making this movie something worth enjoying. What would need to be changed to make the Venom franchise into a great series are a series of realistic changes that could easily be done between Venom and Venom 2. It wouldn't take much, and if a strong director or writer were given a chance to make those changes, Venom could be a great franchise going forward. There's enough potential here that we could easily have a great franchise if the right creators were given a chance with this character. Whether or not Sony's actually going to do that, the ever-frustrating presence of Woody Harrelson kind of makes me think it's unlikely. It feels like we're only a few tweaks away from a great franchise overall. So yeah, Venom sucked, and I am always going to side-eye people a little bit who defend this movie a little too hard. But it's not the worst thing I've ever seen. It's certainly not the worst comic book movie I've ever seen. It's just pretty damn disappointing. And given that this is the same year Sony also produced and created Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, it feels particularly disappointing, particularly alarming, and particularly telling that without a doubt, Venom was the movie that Sony executives were definitely more involved in the production of compared to Spider-Verse. These guys at Sony are just some of the worst executives in the entire movie industry, it seems, and yeah, if you're being honest, if you're looking at this film with a fair mind, recognizing its pros and cons, I don't see how you can honestly say this is even a great movie. It's decent at best. Somewhere in the average or below average range in the grand giant scale of comic book movies at this point. And for a 2018 movie, that feels pretty damn disappointing. Where other movies excelled and did a great job at showcasing comic book characters in a fun way, this movie fell a little short. But next up is the best of 2018, the #1 spot. And it's also a movie, as I hinted in the #2 best of video, and a pretty cool one that I'm looking forward to talking about. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching. If you like Comic Island, be sure to check out our Patreon page below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.